afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our third Palaver series. My name is Wheeler Winstead, and I am the Assistant Director for the Center of African Studies. First, I want to thank our partners for making this happen, the Ralph Bunche Center, Ralph Bunche International Affairs Center, and the Department of Political Science here at Howard University. Thank you for being participants and making this happen. For those of you who are not familiar with the center is one of the newest centers here at Howard University, and it was created in order to facilitate advanced level or advanced skill knowledge of continental Africa and African languages. And the center is here for both students of the university, but also the community. And in terms of the community, we mean the institutions in the community, local schools, and also other institutions, houses of worship, who might be interested in having information about Africa and expanding their knowledge of Africa. The center was funded by the International and Foreign Language Education Program of the U.S. Department of Education Title VI program. The Palaver series is a series of discussions related to Africa that bring together prominent scholars and public servants in collaborations with universities and other university departments for the purpose of shedding light on what we believe are some of the most pressing issues facing Africa today. And the Palaver series was actually started, well, at least when became aware of it, by the Department of African Studies, and then the Center for African Studies actually is collaborating with the Department of African Studies. The reason I bring that up is when I heard about the Palaver series, I wasn't quite sure what a palaver was. And, so we did a little research, and I read something that palaver had to do with the Spanish word palaver, which I guess it means word. I don't know, Dr. Cham, you can want to shed some more light on this. But I was always wondering about the palaver, and then I became aware that palaver was this session or a series of discussions that happened in Africa or that traditional Africans had. So I am really, really excited today that since all of the palaver sessions we've been having, that we're actually going to talk about what a palaver is, and we will be having this discussion led by someone who has actually participated in palavers in Africa, Dr. Stanton. And so he'll be introduced a little later, but I just wanted to, tell you my interest in why this is so exciting, because finally we're going to hear someone talk about what a palaver is and how it really works. A little housekeeping. The session is being videotaped, and that's important for you to know because you can share with all of your friends who were trying to get here and they couldn't get here because of the weather, that they will be able to watch the session on, I believe it'll be both on YouTube and on our website when it comes up. So these sessions are going to be available for the community and for those interested in knowing about it. At the end of the presentation, there will be a question and answer period, and that's going to be led by Dr. Lusane. So this particular palaver session is called the African Palaver, a time-honored institution for public discourse, governance, and conflict resolution. And our presenter is Dr. Craig Stanton, and Dr. Lusane will be giving you a little bit more information about him, a little bit more about his background. Our moderator discussing today is Dr. Clarence Lusane. Dr. Lusane is the chair of the Department of Political Science at Howard, where he also received his PhD. And he is a journalist and active writer and has been so for more than 30 years and has written on both national and international issues such as anti-racism politics, globalization, U.S. foreign policies, human rights, and various social issues. And his most recent work, and I was wishing he would have copies of it, is his most recent book, which is entitled The Black History of the White House, which is a great book. So, if you want to read a good book about the Black history, which we now are going to have, we are now in the process of experience something unique about that Black history with our new Black president. So you'll have to write an edition, a revised edition right after this president gets done, I guess. So Dr. Clarence Lusane is going to be moderating our session. So again, thank you all for coming. And if you have questions that you would like to ask, I think we want to hold them till after your presentation, or would you like them to ask them during?
Well, I think they can, maybe after, because then it'll all be compact and then we can just go wherever the questions lead us.
Great, okay. So if you have questions, why don't you note them down, and Dr. Lusane will make sure you get those questions answered. So, Dr. Lusane?
Thank you, Dr. Winstead. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. My thanks to the Center for African Studies, the Department for African Studies, and the chairman, Professor Tom, and to the Department of Political Science for sponsoring this. I actually really am glad to be here at the Ralph Bunche Center. Many years ago, this is where I made my transition from graduate student to PhD, because this is where I did my doctoral defense. And that was in 1997. And in 1997, this was the only place on campus where you could do a PowerPoint presentation. And it was myself and another student from the political science department. We were the first two on Howard's campus to do PowerPoint presentations. And at the time, everybody said, nobody's going to do that stuff anymore. That stuff is going to play out. Nobody's going to use PowerPoint ever again. That did turn out to be true. But I'm really glad to be here, and I'm really glad to be able to talk about and have a conversation about this really important topic about genocide. My own experiences with dealing with this issue, which makes me really excited about having Dr. Stanton here, is that I took a group of students to Rwanda a few years ago, and we spent time not only looking at what happened during the genocide, but equally important, what happened afterwards. And I think this is where Dr. Stanton's work is really critical, because we have to look at how do societies recover from these extraordinary circumstances where people in the society have killed each other in very dramatic and in very massive kinds of ways. Rwanda has a similar system called Gakaka, I think I'm pronouncing it right, that does these kind of village level courts. We were able to attend a couple of those. These were important in Rwanda because you had hundreds of thousands of people who had been involved in the genocide. And so the court system could not handle that. So for many of the atrocities that were done at the village level, they implemented this system that had existed, as Dr. Stanton will talk about, all over Africa, but they implemented it in Rwanda, and it meant that they were able to institutionalize a form of justice that could meet the needs of the post-genocide situation that they faced after 1994. And even up until now, that system is still in use across the country. Dr. Stanton is one of the leading scholars in the world around this issue. He's a research professor in genocide studies and prevention at George Mason University in Virginia. He's best known for his work in the area of genocide studies. He's the founder and president of Genocide Watch, the founder and director of the Cambodian Genocide Project, and the founder and chair of the International Campaign to End Genocide. For a number of years, he has been the go-to person when you really want to get a perspective on the means by which societies are dealing with post-genocide circumstances. And again, those are as critical to pay attention to, and particularly for those of us in political science, those of us in the Department of African Studies, those are as critical as to understanding what were the causes and the expressions of genocide, but how people reacted. And if we look at those lessons, those are lessons that aren't just for a particular region, but lessons for the world as a whole. So it is my great honor, my great pleasure, and I'm very happy to introduce to you Dr. Gregory Stanton. Thank you.
Well, I'm very grateful to be here. I especially appreciate the fact that you brought in the gachacha system in Rwanda, because that came directly from what I had learned about dispute resolution in the Ivory Coast, in Côte d'Ivoire. I was actually in Rwanda in 1988 and 89, before the genocide, as a academic specialist for the U.S. Cultural program that sent academics to consult with governments about how to do various things that those governments considered problems. And one of the problems they found in Rwanda was that the Belgian-imposed justice system just wasn't working. It took the average of 6 years for a civil case to get through, for instance. And so they asked me, because I'm both an anthropologist and an international lawyer, to come in and essentially do field work in their justice system, and then make recommendations about how they could improve or make changes to their justice system and make it work. Well, remember, this was under the Habyarimana regime. This was before the 1994 genocide, although there had been many genocidal massacres before that. And one of my main recommendations, besides some what you could call procedural changes in the existing judicial system, was that they re-adopt the gachacha system that was the traditional Rwandan way of resolving disputes. Most of these disputes, of course, weren't over genocide. They were, who owns a cow, or, who owns this piece of land, or, all kinds of disputes that arise between people, because no matter what society you're in, there are going to be disputes between people. And I never forget the response of the young Minister of Justice at the time when he read my report. He said, "Oh, we can't do that. They'll think we're primitive." And I said, "No, they won't. They will just think you're Rwandan." And do you know what was interesting about it was that when I first met Paul Kagame after the genocide in 1994, and we had I think it was at least 2-hour talk. I mean, he is brilliant. One of the first things I recommended to him was, in fact, that they use the gachacha system to resolve this impenetrable problem of having 130,000 people in prisons that were built by the Belgians to hold about 20,000 people. And those people just were rotting there in these prisons, and they did for several years until the gachacha system got up and running. Since that time, they have had over 100,000 gachacha trials at the local level. And I must say, I think Rwanda is the best example of how to deal with post-genocidal justice and reconciliation. And it's because they use this traditional system, which works. It's not formal. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch went ape when they learned they were going to use the gachacha system, because they won't have lawyers, and they won't have all the procedural faldermoral that we're used to in our justice system, as though somehow that was sacred. And the truth is, it was far truer to the Rwandan tradition to use that system, in which people literally sat on the grass. That's what gachacha means in Kinyarwanda, and dealt with their, well, in this case, much more important than who owns a cow problem of what happened during that genocide. Who saw this man do what? And giving him a chance to answer if he had an answer. And you may have seen some of the films about this. I think probably the best one that I know of about the Rwandan genocide is called Sometimes in April, in which it ends with an actual gacaca trial, and a very accurate portrayal of that. Well, I'll tell you how I knew that this was a possible solution. I was educated by Africans. I learned this in Cote d'Ivoire when I was a Peace Corps volunteer, and then when I went back to do my doctoral research in anthropology. I was a doctoral student at the University of Chicago under the great anthropologist Victor Turner, who had done his work on schism and continuity in an African society in what is now Zambia, among the Ndembu. And he's one of the fathers of modern symbolic anthropology. So what I want to do is describe to you what I learned in the Ivory Coast. Because what I learned there was that the Palaver system worked so efficiently among the Ebre people of the Ivory Coast, and for that matter among a lot of other Akan peoples of the southern Ivory Coast and Ghana. And the Ebre are an Akan people, that there was almost no violence. It resolved disputes so much more effectively than any system that we have developed in this country, for example, that I honestly wish we could adopt it here. But I'm afraid, unfortunately, that the basic social fabric that is necessary for it to work probably doesn't exist anymore in this country, except perhaps in small towns and villages. So let me just describe to you, first, let me give you an overall view of where the Palaver system fits into systems of dispute resolution. There are two basic types of dispute resolution. There are dyadic and triadic systems, and there are two types of consent to dispute resolution, one over procedure and the other over outcome. Now, the dyadic types of dispute resolution include negotiation directly between the parties, in which there is a bilateral agreement, consent over the agreement, and many disputes, as you know, in many societies are solved through this type of dispute resolution. Another way, of course, that we know all too well is coercion, where one party simply uses superior power to solve the dispute. That is unilateral imposition. Often you result in very unhappy losers in those situations. And then finally, a third type is simple avoidance. When you have a dispute, sometimes one of the parties just decides to completely avoid the dispute and avoid the other person. And I'm afraid we have entirely too much of that in this society, in which, literally people living right next door to each other won't even speak to each other because they have some kind of dispute that's gone on for year after year after year. Believe me, that would not happen in the village I grew up in Africa. That was where I learned that this type of approach is not very healthy for a village or for a society. Sometimes it's important. Sometimes you have to use avoidance, but it is, and it's very good, by the way, in cases of road rage. If you have a guy who is honking at you behind you at the intersection, you should avoid. You should simply close your window, and you should learn to say, as my father, who was a pastor, used to say, Jesus loves you too. It's much better than getting angry and stomping around and getting into a fight. The triadic types of dispute resolution are, and we have this especially in our society, legally imposed adjudication. Courts, where the legal system has set up ways to resolve disputes, informal ways in which you literally build courts, and you have, subpoenas and all the other procedures that go along with that. That's what, by the way, Amnesty and Human Rights Watch didn't like about the gacaca system. There was no real adjudication system built into it. The second type is arbitration. Now, you've read lots of arbitration clauses, I'm sure, because now many corporations much prefer this to adjudication. It's much cheaper, and by the way, gives them an advantage usually. I want to talk today, however, about the third type of triadic dispute resolution, which is mediation through bilateral agreement with mutual consent. And that is the basis of the Palaver system that is used in this whole area of West Africa, and I think is probably used elsewhere as well. Let me now introduce you to the Hebraic people with whom I lived. They are about 100,000 people who live along the Hebraic Lagoon to the very southern part of the Ivory Coast, as we call it, Côte d'Ivoire, right around Abidjan. Many of them are fishermen. Now many work in the city in Abidjan. They do all sorts of work. They have become landowners. They own many plantations now in the southern Ivory Coast. I never forget some of the comments they used to make about other groups of people, ethnic groups of people, who they hired to work on their plantations. I mean, these comments, honestly, sort of made me laugh sometimes. I remember once when somebody said to me, well, you know, these Baola, and by the way, Houphouët-Boigny was Baola. He was the president of the country, and he was a great man, by the way, and I knew him personally. So these Baola, well, they're in charge of the country now, you know, and Houphouët and all that, but, you know, they used to be our slaves. And, yeah, they're okay, I guess, but I wouldn't want my daughter to marry one of them. I mean, the sort of ethnocentrism that you'll find anywhere in any country, anywhere, was even there among the Hebraic and among people all over. I think ethnocentrism, in fact, is at base of all basic ethnocentric type conflicts, including genocide. If people ask me, well, what's the real basic root of genocide, I have to say it's ethnocentrism. Now, the Hebraic were a very tightly knit society. It was a matrilineal society. That means that a young man would inherit property from his mother's brother. The inheritance did not extend to women, so it was still a patriarchal society in that sense. But you didn't inherit from your father. You inherited from your mother's brother. One result of a matrilineal system is there is no illegitimacy. No one can be illegitimate because everyone knows they have a mother. And pretty much everybody knows who that mother is. So there is no illegitimate child among the Hebraic. However, there was also patrilocal residence. In other words, you grew up with your father, and the wife of the father, your mother, would live in the father's compound. Now, there is a built-in tension in that society because of that, of those two different strains, if you will, in the society. If you're going to inherit from your uncle, and yet you're going to live with your father, and your father's making you work for him, it can cause some real problems later when your uncle dies and you inherit it from the uncle. And it also can cause problems even earlier than that when you're saying to your father, you know, I'm not going to inherit any of this. You know, what's really in it for me? So, and I'll tell you about a dispute that in fact came down to that in this talk today. Now, the Hebraic had a cross-cutting system to this matrilineal system, which they had matriclans, and that was the age-set system. Every 4 years, a new age set was formed. And the age sets were named Dugbo, Chagba, Bleswe, and Nyando. Now, I happened to belong to the Neando age set when I was in that village. The openness to accept me into that village was extraordinary. I was just so lucky to have lived with these people. Well, part of it was that unlike many Peace Corps volunteers, I was not content with just speaking French. I wanted to learn Ebrier. I knew that if I didn't learn Ebrier, I would never understand the people I was living with. And so I actually hired a teacher to teach me Ebrier. Every 4 years, or every 16 years, 4 of these age sets would be combined into what is called an age group. So you then had a system of, if you will, seniority in the village, in which the power in the village was transferred from one age group to the next about every 16 years. And I was lucky because the age group and age set that I happened to belong to was at that time the main leaders in the village, even though they let me in, even though I was technically younger than I should have been to get into their age group and age set. So I was a Neando Dogba, very proud of it too. And you spent a lot of your Saturday afternoons, sitting around drinking beer and gin and eating the good food that the ladies of the age set prepared for us. And believe me, it was a man's world. I really had a good time. But I think the women did too. I think they had a lot of fun, gossiping and having a lot of time with their children. And they did most of the work, however, I've got to admit it. Now, the Ebrier were Christians. They were converted by the prophet William Wada Harris in 1914 to 15. A very extraordinary story. William Wada Harris was a Grebo from Liberia who had been arrested by the by the Liberian authorities for raising the Union Jack, the British flag, over his house, because he thought Liberia would be better off under the British than it was under the Americo-Liberians, who were exploiting the local groups. That's why Firestone Rubber was, had taken over a good part of Liberia. Well, William Wada Harris was a Christian. He'd been raised in the Methodist Church, and he had very, I'd say, orthodox theology. But while he was arrested and in jail, he had a visitation from the angel Gabriel, who told him to go preach the gospel to the people of the Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. And so he put on white robes. He had a staff in the form of a cross. He had a calabash in which he could hold water for baptism. And he then proceeded to walk down the beach all the way down the Ivory Coast and Ghana and preached to the people all along that whole southern part of the Ivory Coast and Ghana in Pidgin English, which was the lingua franca at the time, translated into the local languages by clerks in the local stores. In a year and a half, he converted 250,000 people. This is an untold story of the mission of the Christian church. This ought to be made in a movie. I mean, this is one of the greatest missionary stories of all time. And these people, the Ebrier, had been converted. So they already were Christians before any white people ever saw them. There had been French missionaries who had tried to create, Catholic churches in some of the places along that way. And Harris himself actually didn't try. He said, just go to whatever church there is, but the Catholic priest wouldn't accept the conversion that he had provided, and so they set up their own churches. When he was kicked out of the Ivory Coast in 1915 by the French, because they realized this was getting out of hand, this guy was really influential, they sent him back to Liberia, wouldn't let him come back. He predicted, this is Harris, he predicted that 10 years after his departure, a missionary, a white missionary, would get off a boat in Grand Bassam and bring them schools and hospitals. Well, 10 years after that, and I've heard this directly from the missionary who was the guy who got off the boat, because I interviewed him before he died. 10 years to the year, a man named William Platt got off a boat in Grand Bassam, was met by an Hebraier who came to meet the boat after a dream said to come meet him. And he took him through these villages, and all these people were already Christians. And he said, I have a copy of the telegram. He cabled back to the London Missionary Society. He said, send teachers, send hospitals. These people don't need missionaries. They're already Christians. Anyway, these people, in other words, had in many ways been converted to the Christian gospel, and a very, I'd say, theologically sound version of it too. So let me talk then about the mediation system, the Palaver. And let me present it to you in terms of 3 case studies that I was involved with. It's always best, as you know, to tell stories. Jesus knew that, and so does every African. Any good speaker knows that too. So let me tell you about the improperly installed water faucet. Now, the way mediation works in the Palaver system is that a party who has a grievance or who knows he's done something wrong, and by the way, the Palaver system works best when one person knows he's at fault, tries to find a mediator that would be acceptable to both sides in the dispute. And that often means finding someone who has ties to both parties. You know, either they be in the same clan or the same age set or a related age set, because there were alliances between the age sets and so forth. It's also very important that the mediator be seen by the other party as essentially neutral in the dispute. So what happened in this case was that one of my friends, Joro Hippolyte, was the nephew. In other words, he was going to inherit from his mother's brother, and he and his uncle, Inteko in Hebraier, undertook a joint construction project of a house. Hippolyte had some income because he was working as a mechanic, a very good mechanic, in a Mercedes garage downtown in Abidjan. So he was investing. This is a very good way to invest among the Hebraiers, to build a house. It's a very solid form of investment. Can't go walk away, you know. And he had gotten permission from his uncle to rent out a room in the house. They were building a 3-story house to a Congolese shopkeeper. And his uncle had gone away on a trip somewhere, and the Congolese shopkeepers came to Hippolyte and said he wanted to have a water faucet installed in his room so that he could just have running water. And well, of course, the village I was living in was connected to the municipal water system of Abidjan, so you could get running water in your houses. Hippolyte said, fine, this is a good idea. And Hippolyte was doing the collection of the rent anyway, so he just took some of it and he got the water faucet installed. And when his uncle got back from his trip, he was furious because Hippolyte had not consulted him. Well, Hippolyte knew that wasn't right. He should have consulted his uncle. So Hippolyte came to me and asked me to be his mediator. I asked him, why me? He said, well, there's two reasons. He said, first of all, you speak Ebree. Secondly, everybody knows you don't belong to either of our any of the matriclans or you are a member of an age set and so forth, but it's, you're really neutral in this party. And thirdly, and this was probably the most important one of all, you can keep a secret. He knew this wouldn't leak out, this dispute between him and his uncle to other people in the village, because you want to save face in many, many societies, and this was one where that was the case. So, I went to his uncle, Ajay Emmanuel. I bought 6 big bottles of Solibra Bach beer with me, and Hippolyte and I first got permission to talk to him, and then Hippolyte and I went and met with him after exchanging greetings, which involves at least 3 handshakes all the way around. And it also involves asking about the health of the other party and the other party's family. You don't just get down to business, so that's pretty impolite. And you ask about, the relatives and so forth. We then sat down. Hippolyte then told me why we had come. Hippolyte said to me, I was the mediator, I have come to ask pardon of my uncle. And then my job was, as a mediator, to restate what Hippolyte had said. And we're all sitting right there. Restate it in terms of a norm of that society that would bring the dispute to the point where they could come to an agreement. And so my statement to the uncle was, Hippolyte has come because he is your nephew, and he knows how important it is to retain good relations with his Inteko, his mother's brother, because that is the basis for our whole society here among the Ebree, that we keep this kind of harmony. And Emmanuel then spoke back to me and said, yes, I was very upset when he didn't ask permission to use this money to put in this faucet and so forth. But he said, I am very grateful that you've come to ask pardon, and so I forgive. And so I was able to tell Hippolyte that he forgave him, and that and Hippolyte then asked his uncle if his uncle would consent to having the water faucet reinstalled. The uncle, by the way, had the water faucet taken out when he got home, because he said he didn't get permission from me, and he took the faucet out. Hippolyte said, could you please put the faucet back, because the Congolese tenant is really a bit upset about this. And so the uncle said, yes, I will put the faucet back. And so then I was able, as a mediator, and it went through us. It was a 3-way conversation. Every statement was made through me, and then was also restated in terms of a transcendent norm. We were then, at the end, finally, I was able to announce that both parties had agreed. The uncle had pardoned Hippolyte, and the uncle would allow Hippolyte to reinstall the faucet. So we had a resolution to this conflict. It didn't leak out that there had ever even been a conflict, and we had a resolution. Now I want to talk about another thing. We shook hands. I got so used to shaking hands, both at greeting and saying goodbye, that when I came back to the United States from the Peace Corps, and people didn't do this when they were, saying goodbye after they, talked for a while or something out on the campus or whatever, I had this strange feeling that like something was wrong. What did I do wrong? Until I finally realized that I was just used to African parting rituals, and Americans didn't do those. And so I hadn't really done anything wrong to that person at all. I was just missing out on the handshakes, because I really liked them. And I thought that touching of people is really I still think it's a good thing. And if you study good politicians, by the way, They are physical people. LBJ was well known for this. His handshake was more than a handshake. I've shaken LBJ's hand when I was a young man. He would put his arm all the way around you like that. Now, Joe Biden is made fun of for doing that right now, but that is the kind of personal touch. Touch is very important to people. Anyway, okay, let me get to a second dispute. This is a land dispute between two villages. Now, this is the kind of dispute that isn't just between two people. This was a situation in which we had a situation that arose because of a conflict of laws, is what a lawyer would tell you. The everyday norm is to marry within your village. It means you keep things kind of local that way. And the French law, the French Ivoirian law that had been imposed at the time of colonialism, on the other hand, didn't recognize collective property. It recognized only individually owned property. So we had a clash here that arose because a woman from one village, Songonte, had married a man from another village, Songon Dagbe. Her children would thereby inherit from the uncle who had stayed behind in Songonte. Well, the uncle died. Now her son, the uncle's nephew, who had grown up in Songon Dagbe, was under Ebrier law to inherit the land and the other property that, the uncle owned. The trouble was that the property that the part of the property the nephew was going to inherit was undeveloped land out in what was then the jungle that they wanted to develop and make into a palm oil plantation area. Palm oil was a very big crop, money-making crop in the southern Ivory Coast. So the two villages said, okay, whose land is this? Songonte said, look, under collective ownership law of the Ebrier, this land should revert to Songonte because it was undeveloped. We don't accept this idea of individual ownership. That land never was developed, so it should just go straight back to the village, to Songonte. Songon Dagbe said, no, we're going to apply French Ivoirian law, and it should be owned by the nephew, who legitimately inherited it. Therefore, the land belongs to Songon Dagbe. The Superfe, who's a government official in the Ivorian system, he's official government person, but who happened to be Ebrier, so he knew the culture. Knew there was this conflict, and so he ordered the villages in the fratry, which is a type of grouping of villages that you'll find in many societies, to settle this dispute between these two villages. So the villages got together, we agreed on a particular time, and the other villages in the fratry, Songon Mambrate, Songon Kasemble, and Songon Agban, got together in the middle of the jungle. I went out there with them, and they had asked me to mediate this dispute. Once again, I said, why me? And they said, we know that you are completely neutral. Plus, you speak Ebrier. I mean, we haven't had a white man before who could speak Ebrier. So, we figure you'll give us a good way to have this hearing and come out with a resolution that we all agree to. And so that was my job, is to be the mediator in this dispute. And of course, the job of the mediator is not to be an arbitrator, not to decide the dispute. It is to bring the parties together on an agreed solution. So we got together, and at first, Songon Dagbe was 2 hours late. Well, you can imagine all the others who were sitting there in the middle of this steamy jungle, waiting, and mosquitoes all around and everything. Were starting to grumble. I mean, there's a lot of tolerance for heat and all kinds of discomfort, but eventually it gets to you. And if they hadn't shown up, the land, they would have lost the dispute, hands down. Songonte would have taken the land. But Songo and Dagbe did show up, so then we held the mediation. Both sides gave their side of the argument, again through me, in which I reinterpreted the statements of each side to the other side, even though everybody was sitting right there and they could hear the original statements. But in this case, it was doubly complex, because we were talking about two systems of law that conflicted. And I knew it, that they conflicted. I also knew the superfe was Ebrier, so he would understand that they conflicted. Well, the elders were sitting there from all these villages. We discussed it back and forth and so forth. And finally, the villages together, all the village elders together, decided on what I could only call a Solomonic solution. They split the land. They said, okay, part of it's going to go to Songonte, part of it's going to Songon Dagbe. You can develop it, you'll get the income from it, but since it's undeveloped land, we'll apply Ebrier law and we'll apply French law to this. So it won't become a continual conflict. And here's where the line is. So they resolved that dispute. So I was able to announce a solution there, and as far as I know, it's still in effect. The final dispute I just want to talk to you about, it's not really a dispute, it's more of a situation. And it's really quite dramatic. I wrote a good part of my dissertation about this. Was about the death of one of my friends in the village, Aure Diago Francois. Aure Diago Francois was a modernized Ebrier, a real up-and-comer. A guy who was simply made to succeed. Very, very smart. Always first in his class. The captain of every team he was on. The head of the Catholic Youth League. All of this. So he gets sent off to the National School for Public Administration, which is very hard to get into. He's then hired into the government service. He's given a plush job up in Bunche, which is in the middle of the country, and it's a Baule area where he was sent. He falls in love with and marries a Baule woman. Now, believe me, this is not exactly proper under Ebrier law. But what can I say? I believe, and I truly do believe, love is the most powerful force on the planet, and he fell in love with her. Como Baya Bernadette. I know her. She and he had 6 children. Well, his Inteko, his uncle, who lived in Bokoso, this village, Kutuan Dibi, was very proud of him, and she gave him he gave Francois 2 million francs to construct some housing in the village. Well, instead, Francois went out and bought a Mercedes. His uncle wasn't too pleased about that, but his uncle was a forgiving man, so he also gave him a house in Bokoso and expected him to come live there. Well, Francois and his brother Blaise did go live there for about a year and a half after Francois was reassigned to a job in Abidjan. But then, because he had a pretty high-paying job, Francois was able to then buy a house in the suburban luxury suburb just above the village where we were, called Cocody, a very nice part of Abidjan, the nicest part of Abidjan. It's sort of the McLean of Abidjan. And he bought this house and then, get this, rented out the house he owned in our village in Bocos, rented it out to Ghanaian prostitutes. Well, you can well imagine the opinion of that in the village. Not only that, this house stuck out into the street, and the government had decreed what they call lotissement. They were gonna measure off streets so they'd be straight and so forth. This was a village which, up to that time, all the streets were made out of sand. In fact, I remember many a night when I used to sleep out on those streets, because in the hot part of the year, you didn't want to sleep inside a concrete structure, let me tell you. You wanted to get outside. And it was a wonderful thing. You slept with your age set. And we all just lay down in the sand and looked up at the stars and talked until the early hours of the morning. And I think some of the biggest insights I ever had in that whole time came from that. And we can talk about that perhaps if you'd like, because I just look back with that at that time with great affection. Anyway, Francois developed a heart condition, and he had to go to the hospital. And he went to the hospital, and in fact, I visited him there. I knew his family, and he went to the hospital. They took care of the heart condition. He came back, went back to his house in Copedy and so forth. But then the heart condition reappeared, and he had to go back to the hospital. And one night, his mother came and announced to all of us that he had died. Francois had died. Well, the talk in the village was he had died because of his disobeying the basic rules of the Ebrier, and that a member of his family had done sorcery against him because of it. There's still a very strong belief in sorcery. I mean, some people call it witchcraft. After all, you can call it that if you want. We were strong believers here in this country until the early 1600s, as you know. Witchcraft is a spiritual force that a lot of people around the world believe in. And in this case, the Ebriers still think that the world is a spiritual place. It is not something made out of material alone. There are spiritual forces that we have to face in the world. And actually, I understand that. Anyway, they thought a member of his family had to have done sorcery against him, because sorcery mainly comes from a member of your family. But then the question came, so what happens to the house? Well, the elders in the village, having been ordered by the city that part of that house, at least, one corner of it, had to be taken off because they'd done this surveying and it stuck out into the street. And they were planning to build a real street there, not just sand. The elders of the village got together and we had a village meeting. I'll never forget this meeting. It went on for, I think, 8 hours. And everybody had a say. Now, this was not a palaver, really, because you didn't have a mediator here. But you did see the whole social structure of the village working. You had each of the main age groups, 4 age groups, and you had the Matfer clan. They all seated separately in the heart of the village. And each of these groups has a spokesperson who is gifted at speaking. We, for instance, had a man named Rene, and he was just eloquent when he spoke. So the debate went back and forth about what to do. And ultimately, when it came down to going to the very top, the oldest man in the village, the patriarch of the village, and some of the oldest chiefs, the former chiefs of the village, they moved on, they retired as chiefs. They said this house has to be torn down. This house has been built illegally. Has been the cause of this sorcery that has killed one of our people, and we cannot allow this house to. And now it's a house of prostitution. This house is going to be torn down. And so the village decided that was going to be the solution to this dispute. And that house was torn down. So that is the end of what I have to say to you about the Palaver system and how it was able to resolve so many disputes among the Ebre in that village that in that entire time I was there, and that was for 4 years, I did not see a single incident of fisticuffs or other physical violence in that village. And that's a village of 3,000 people. I'd like to see a single town in America that make the same claim. It was because they had this remarkable system of dispute resolution. I think it depended very much on the way that society had so many cross-cutting ties, and everyone knew each other and had a respect for each other as a person. Would that we had it here. Thank you.
So now we're going to.
I have a question about reparations. Did you come across any cases in which there were material reparations offered for people who had been wronged?
Oh, yes, indeed. Yeah, I remember one case, for example, in which it was alleged that a bulldozer that was clearing the way for one of these streets they were going to build had swept away some gravel that had been put out into the street to help build a house that was about to be constructed. And the owner of the gravel complained to the village elders and said, you know, I bought that gravel. This is a real loss to me. And the village elders met about it and said, yes, that was wrong. They should have kept that from happening. And so, in fact, they did buy a replacement. They bought a replacement of that gravel. That's reparations. And I've also seen other type of reparations when, you know, I mean, it can be big or it can be small. I mean, but yes, reparations are a pretty regular thing.
Just want to follow up on Anita's question, which I think, I mean, the element of reparation that she brings up is really key.
Thank you.
Whether in this, the Palaver system, as you were able to observe it over the years, what sort of mechanisms are inbuilt into the system for, let's say, parties or people who are found guilty? You know, I mean, what kinds of atonement or punishment or whatever is sort of figured to be part of this?
Sure.
I'm raising this because, I mean, if you look at the case of South Africa, for example,
Yes.
you know, with the TRC
Right.
commission that actually, you know, I mean, unfolded, but then there was some disaffection on the part of quite a significant part of the population because of the absence of the other part, you know, justice.
I know very well because I've lived there.
And I mean, I'm just wondering to what extent, you know, in the system as you've observed it.
Right. Well, on of course.
In the village setting, I think it works quite well. But when you are dealing at a macro level,
that's right.
What are some of those elements that are in there that would sort of prevent, you know, recurrence of this? I mean, if you take the case of Burkina Faso, for example, right
Yes.
now,
Right.
where the person who was behind this
Coup
silly
attempt.
action, you know, has come out and said this was the biggest mistake, you So he's expressed some kind of remorse there.
Right.
Now.
And
I
thank
mean,
God they didn't have to kill any of his troops
Yeah.
when they took back control.
Mhm.
Boy, I just breathed a sigh of relief when I heard that. Because as you well know, in most of Africa at least, if someone is killed, then reparations of a very material sort need to be paid. In the case of a village, yes, it's often the case, say someone's been harmed in some way or another that has cost them money or things like this. The party that admits fault, and as I say, the Palaver system works best when you do have that sort of confession and absolution, if you will, who admits fault will frequently say, well, okay, then I will make you right. I will make sure you have, that you'll be restored to what you should have been. But in the case of major social restitution and reparations, you have to have I think you have to have a consensus within the society, first of all, by the people who have inflicted the harm, that they have inflicted the harm. You have to have confession, in other words. And what I know about South Africa, having been a Fulbright professor in Swaziland, is that part of the white population sees that the harm was inflicted, but there's a very large part that still thinks apartheid was just fine, thank you. And I know that because I have made many trips to South Africa, since then. The other part of it was in South Africa, the ANC, the African National Congress that has governed South Africa since, majority rule, has made reparations really a major part of its platform. Reparations in the form of jobs, of education, of rebalancing employment in the whole society and so forth. And I think they actually have made a lot of progress. People don't give the ANC enough credit for that. But of course they haven't made enough. I mean, it's a gigantic problem. It's like what we deal here with in this country. It's very, very similar. In fact, the pattern is so similar that it should make chills run up and down our spines in this country. Slavery and segregation in our country was so close to the same as slavery and apartheid in South Africa that, I mean, we are sister societies. And we owe our African Americans in this country major reparations. And very few whites will admit this. Affirmative action is a small step compared to what we really owe. 300 years of slavery? I mean, if you just look at the basic figures about wealth that Milton Friedman and a lot of other conservative economists have compiled, and I, by the way, used to walk home sometimes to the University of Chicago with Milton Friedman. I say, what are we going to do about these inequalities? He said, give them money. Seriously, that was his answer. He said, give them money. Now, this guy saw it. He knew this was wrong. And he said, if we're going to make this right, we have to pay. And I mean, you don't hear that from many of the Republican candidates right now. You don't hear any of them saying give them money. He was in many ways a radical libertarian, of course. And, my view is very similar. We need to keep up we need to keep up affirmative action in a very, very determined way in this country if we are going to ever address these terrible problems. And I also believe that for Native Americans, of course. So overall, I think the whole process of confession and absolution is essential to having reparations be accepted by a society. And right now, we don't have confession. In fact, one of my stages of genocide, if you take a look at our website, genocidewatch.net, I've outlined the basic stages in which genocide occurs. And we had genocide in this country, not only against our Native Americans, but also against our African slaves who came across the Atlantic. Both of those were genocides. In the case of genocide, the 10 stages always end with denial. The 10th stage of genocide in every genocide is denial. People don't want to talk about it. And in fact, there's some genocides, as you well know, where you don't even hear about it in school. I don't remember hearing about it much when I was, being educated as a young man. Now, at least, the Congress has apologized to African Americans. But do you know this? Not one bill has ever passed Congress, even a resolution has ever passed Congress apologizing to Native Americans for what we did to them. I find that amazing. So, in fact, I want to have a counter Columbus Day march on Constitution Avenue someday. Columbus was a genocidist. This guy killed off nearly all the Indians on Hispaniola. He didn't even believe they had souls. So we're celebrating this as a national holiday? I find it astonishing. I guess there's one state, Washington, where they've renamed the day now, the state of Washington. And I think they call it Indigenous Peoples Day or something like that now. But so I don't think we are there yet in terms of reparations. Yeah.
You started your presentation with Amnesty International's reservation about not using the Western model for reconciliation. And I was reminded this week of Justice Stephen Breyer's book, where he says he was attacked for suggesting that the U.S. legal system should incorporate experiences from the world.
Absolutely.
So given and you showed great points on how this applies both to the U.S. and then to Africa, where the United States had statistics of being the number one prison holder ahead of China, I think it might be. So given these realities and the denial, could you see how your views and the idea of the Palaver, the non-rigid Western system applying not just conflict resolution but to other forms of solving society's problems, reflected both in the legal systems, international legal systems, and in the discourse in academia, which have the Eurocentric model imposed on leave alone to apply it for the US, even for Africa?
Yeah, indeed, I could, because in fact, when I taught negotiations and mediation and dispute resolution at Washington and Lee, I always included training in Palaver because I believed it to be such a successful system for dispute resolution. So I think it could easily be worked into dispute resolution. Now, most of that type of dispute resolution is, of course, in the kinds of disputes that are settled out of court. But there's no reason why it couldn't be also something that courts could tell people to go do. Now, I think, for example, a lot of divorce courts ought to do that. They do, to some degree. They usually have a counseling type of phase in the whole divorce procedure. But it would be very interesting to try using palavers to settle lots of marital disputes. I know it's one of the biggest problems in most disputes is that the two parties don't listen to each other. And the whole idea behind the palaver system is to help the other person listen and to protect their personality. So I do think it's possible. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the problems I think Africa is still dealing with is the aftermath of colonization and the inability to have mental decolonization. And that has created some kind of social split institutions and individuals in African system. For instance, the young Chief Justice in Rwanda who told you that if we apply this system, they'll think we're primitive. And that removes the human person from authenticity of the person you are and the structure you grew up in. And as an anthropologist, what do you think, since this Palaver system helps communities in Africa to deal with conflict issues and of course in a very profitable and fruitful manner? What do you think could be done to help the African leaders today experiencing both sides of the coin, what happens in the West and what goes on in Africa, and you have seen how fruitful it is. How do you think this process of mental decolonization can help the African states to embrace what we have in the face of Western influence? Because always you have the Western influence, especially the French,
Oh, yes.
will always tell their colonies what to do because of that process of assimilation.
Mhm.
So what do you think could be the path to authentic African actualization of this process of conflict resolution?
I would like to see a lot more Africans who do the research and write about African systems of dispute resolution and then develop what they've learned into university courses and law school courses and so forth, so they can train leaders in Africa about, you know, what really has worked in Africa. And instead of always adopting the colonial model, we can use these systems that have worked, in fact, are far more appropriate for our societies than, say, Belgian systems. Do you remember, in English systems too, the Africans used to come in with white wigs on in their courts? I mean, this is astonishing to me. Why? What is going wrong here? And so you had this a need for, as you say, I think, real training in how we Africans can use that authentic African experience. And the best people to do that are Africans. Very few, you're not going to get enough anthropologists trained to actually speak African languages to do that. African anthropologists, African lawyers, already speak the languages. So let them do that research. Let them write about it. Let them be proud of it. I think that's the answer.
I was thinking that when you started, you waited our appetite on the Rwandan system, that it was one of the best, that it has worked. I was expecting you to dilate on that, to tell us why, what makes it tick, to explain it to us. Of course, some of us have read about it, but this is you.
That's right, and I've seen
You
it.
have an insider's view about it. You have met Kagame himself.
Yeah, I do.
You have been talking about how good it is.
Okay.
You have opportunity today.
Okay. Happy to do that. I will.
Defend it to us.
Happy to do that. I've defended it many times to Amnesty and Human Rights Watch. I can tell you. Ken Roth, by the way, who's head of Human Rights Watch, was a classmate of mine at Yale Law School. So we have lots of fun because we disagree about a lot of things. They didn't like the idea of having a Cambodia tribunal, for instance. Can you believe this? I mean, the Human Rights Watch was opposed to it. And I fought for 30 years to get it. And we got it, by God. I just outlasted him, I think. But you're right. Okay, let's look at the gachacha system. What happens in the gachacha system is people who have been accused of participation in the genocide um, are brought from the prisons, often in their pink uniforms, because in the prisons in Rwanda they wear pink uniforms. Um, and they are brought to the village after, or they don't live in villages in Rwanda, really. They live on hillsides. But the people on the hillsides come together and gather together on the grass, and then the people have already chosen some of the elders of that hillside who are respected by everybody, women and men. And they are going to be the decision makers in these gacaca proceedings. So then the person who is, if you will, a chief person in charge of the proceeding says, now we want to know, has anybody heard about the killing of, children in the school that was, right here right here next to us? And does anyone know anything about that? And then people who are seated there, who have come back and are now living there, will stand up and say, yes, I saw it. And then say, and they can ask that person, okay, and who do you know who participated in that killing? And if that person is one of those people who have been brought in from the prison, which is often the case, they will then say, well, I saw him actually kill so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so, and name them. They then give the chance to the person who's the defendant, if you will, to say, no, I didn't do that. I mean, really, you must have seen somebody else do that, because that day, those days, I'd gone to some other prefecture, someplace else. And then somebody else stands up and says, oh, no, you didn't. I saw you too. So you have a process that's rather informal, really, a back and forth that goes back and forth until there's been enough of a hearing for the people who are going to make the decision to come to a decision about whether this person's guilty or not, and if so, what the punishment should be. And frequently the punishment, in many cases, because these people have often spent years in prison already, is some kind of community service. Now, there's a wonderful film which we happen to be showing at George Mason on October 8th, so I'm putting in a little ad here at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, which is right here in the Arlington campus. You can just get off at Virginia Square GMU stop at 7:15 on October 8th at 17:15 p.m. And it's called As We Forgive. And it is a film made by an American filmmaker who's from right here in Washington, D.C., about two women and how they came to terms with the killers of their families. And they didn't want to at the beginning when she started work on this film. Neither woman wanted to. And the killers themselves at first denied. But seeing the process, watching how she was she took her 2 years to make this film, and watching how it gradually developed, that these women came to actually forgive, as the title says, As We Forgive, to actually forgive these men. In both cases, the men had to confess first before the forgiveness could occur. They had to admit that they did it. After that, everything else broke. So, it's a very interesting dynamic, because I think that the fundamental dynamic of confession and absolution is deep. It's a deep structure in human beings. Anthropologists look for deep structures. We look for things that are truly universal, and I think that is one. So, the gacaca system, to have 100,000 of these trials, I mean, it's astonishing, really, I think.
Yeah, quick, the only thing I'll add on one is to put this in context, because after the genocide, it meant a completely restructuring of Rwandan society. So it isn't just this system, but their memorials, one of the best genocide museums in the world is in
Right.
Kigali. And they literally went around the world. They went to Israel, they went to Germany, and they studied how other countries dealt with post-conflict, post-genocide, and incorporated all of that. So it's in the school curriculums, it's throughout the country. So it isn't just one part, but it really is a consciousness about, A, this should never happen again. We should need to understand why, but we also should learn and present this as a model to the rest of the world of how you deal with these situations once they kind of arise.
And this has been led by the way, not only Rwandan organization, but by a special organization as part of our coalition, the Aegis Trust. It's part of the Alliance Against Genocide that we are the chair of, that Genocide Watch is the chair of. Dear, dear friends of ours. And that museum was built by them. It's a spectacularly successful place, a model.
Yeah, I have a comment and a question. You mentioned that, not here, but when we were talking, some places that Palaver did not work.
Oh, yeah.
I was curious of that, but what also came to my mind, I was thinking about the book, Things Fall Apart.
Oh, boy,
Chinua Achebe.
I love that book.
And, the whole issue where the one, was it a woman who was killed in one village?
Mhm.
And then they went and got the boy from the other village, and he lived with the protagonist for a long time, and then he eventually killed him.
Mhm.
That process, now, we know that's a story. Is that an example of palaver happening between villages and the idea of, well, this woman was killed, so you gotta give us one of your children, and eventually we'll kill them? Is that traditional African, and is that accepted as a way of resolution as a part of palavers?
I don't think it's normal. I wouldn't call it traditional African. The idea of a blood debt to another group is common enough, not just in Africa, but in lots of societies around the world. I could give you some examples of, in fact, attempts at dispute resolution among the Hebraic that didn't work. Where they didn't reach a result. They didn't come to a conclusion. Usually the reason for it is that either one side won't admit that they did anything wrong, or you'll have a situation in which finally the state basically has to come in and act. I said there was one case, for instance, in which they didn't use a palaver, where we had a taxi driver from Burkina Faso come into the village, going about 50 miles an hour down this village street, and he hit one of the kids. Didn't hurt the kid too much, but oh my God, the villagers descended on this guy and beat him, just beat him. And he was lucky to get out of it alive. I mean, really. Somebody ultimately called the police, actually, to get him out of there alive. That was a case, clearly, where the villagers didn't exactly use a palaver to settle that. It was coercion. It was also, I think, caused by the fact he wasn't from the village. He was outside, if you will, the universe of moral obligation that a village consists of. He came from another group, from Burkina Faso. Now, it's interesting that wouldn't have made him exempt from becoming a person in the village, because a good third of the village in Blocoso by that time was from Burkina Faso. So they didn't have anything against people from Burkina Faso. In fact, they used to celebrate each other's religious festivals. The Muslims would come to the Christian festivals, and the Christians would go to the Muslim festivals, which, by the way, I think is a pretty good idea. You know, so just being from Burkina Faso wouldn't have necessarily, it was his act, his recklessness of having hit this child, I think. I think the breadth of the cleavage to be addressed is really what you need to look at if you're going to try to understand what can and what can't be solved through Palavers. If the cleavage is too broad, probably a plotter won't work. This is one of the lessons that Turner in his book, Schism and Continuity in African Society, says about the process of disputes. He outlines 4 steps in disputes. First, there's a breach of a norm-governed social relationship. Secondly, there's a mounting crisis in which the tendency is for the breach to widen. And then either you have redressive action to limit the spread of the breach, or you could have in which it goes down to some of the bedrock systems in the society. I mean, sometimes, for instance, you can study some of the conflicts among the Nuer or the Dinka, which are societies that have hierarchical divisions within them and alliances that form around those divisions, given who is, where the breach occurs. And you'll have new alliances forming depending how deep the breach is. So if you have redressive action to limit the spread of the breach, then you can have reconciliation and reintegration. But you can also, if that doesn't happen, you can have an irreparable breach, a real permanent problem.
They have time for one more.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your presentation. Good afternoon, colleagues. I want to pull more on this notion of limitations. Okay, the Palaver system, I have been a great supporter of that up to certain limits. This summer I was in Côte d'Ivoire, I was in the western region.
Oh, really?
And you were good to point out the issues related to land reform, because there are land reform laws that are not implemented at this time in Côte d'Ivoire. And we're at the intersection of where you still have traditional land holdings, but you also have the government that is imposing the notion of property deeds. Okay, and we have to look at who property deeds protect. All right, now we're in a situation where we're dealing with multi-ethnic communities, not always just one single group, so that their particular Palaver system prevails. We're dealing with different Palaver systems trying to coexist together. And then the other thing that we're dealing with is gender. Most of these Palaver systems do not necessarily defend women. Right. And so we have to look very closely at that as we attempt to defend those systems, because women have no rights in most of those systems. And normally I don't come at it in that direction. But their women's rights are highly limited, like in the case of rape. The tendency for a traditional chief, for instance, will be to defend the rapist, because that's another elder or another male within the village who they want to support, as opposed to supporting the mother of a girl child that has been raped. Okay, so that was very clear at the time. The other issue that you brought up had to do with the sorcery, witchcraft and that kind of thing. But it's not a laughing matter at all. The problem is that we're dealing with extra-legal killings. All right, your friend was killed and probably poisoned. Okay, because as they say, le poison ne pardonne pas. Poison doesn't pardon anybody. You get poison, it's poison. I don't care what you call it, supernatural, natural, whatever. It's poison. All right, so my condolences for your friend, but he was a victim of an extralegal killing. All right, so the only
Or a heart attack, we don't really know.
right, well, we have a name for that too. We call it courte maladie, a very short illness. Right. So the only layer that you have over that, of course, would be the administrative protections. Okay, but to have access to those administrative protections, and here we're talking about law enforcement, okay, through the prefet and the sous-prefet and this kind of thing. So they would have to be engaged in order to have police come.
Right.
Okay, and the other side would, of course, be the courts.
Right.
All right, and then those are also procedural.
Right.
So in those cases, you have to look at how much access people have then to those administrative systems. All right, in the case of, and that, they can only intervene if they are asked to intervene. So the complexity comes in the asking. How many women or younger people in these societies would be so emboldened as to go beyond the village structure or the traditional structures and to ask the administrators, okay, either the police or the justice system, to intervene on their behalf or to get an attorney to represent them? How do you empower women to go outside of their communities to get legal assistance to defend their girl children and boys too against rape? Okay, or to have the people that have committed these crimes to be judged for them. At the same time, we're looking at people that will probably be ostracized within their village communities. Okay, so these things are very complex. My question for you has to do with empowerment. I saw some efforts of empowerment around the women's centers where they actually had an office where the women could come and meet with counsel and discuss their cases and to see if they could move forward. So I want to know from you, what kinds of examples did you see of empowerment? Because clearly the Palaver system isn't enough. People that are disempowered at this time of traditional systems have to have some means of getting justice. And so what are your observations there?
Well, as you probably know, one of the real drawbacks as a male anthropologist in Côte d'Ivoire is you are really not able to do good field work among women, because women almost have a separate society, at least among the Hebrei. They spend their entire lives with other women, pretty much. And so I didn't get much time or ability to do good field work among the women, and I regret that very much. And the person who did was my wife. My wife's a nurse midwife. She was delivering babies in the local maternity. She delivered lots of babies from our village. And by the end of the time we were there, you'd see these little toddlers running around the village. She was appalled, actually, by the mistreatment of mothers in labor by the midwives at that government-run maternity center. Really horrendous mistreatment. They would push down on the fundus, and it could easily have resulted in a rupture of the uterus. They would they'd scream at the women to push, and it was really outrageous. Now, my wife was a Peace Corps volunteer, and she didn't feel that she was in an authoritative position enough to tell them, you can't, stop it, don't do that. Since that time, I have heard her speak, of course, about this, because she's made it one of the causes of her life to get dignity in childbirth for women around the world, actually. She's in charge of the maternal survival programs for USAID around the world now. So she has had quite an impact. But that has become one of her main campaigns in the world, I think. And I think you're right. Women not only are mistreated by men, but they're also mistreated by other women. And in the society, finding ways to defend those rights of women and of other powerless people. You're absolutely right about the limits of society of a system that is basically run by men. The Palaver system is run by men. Now, it's not impossible at all for a palaver to occur among women. In other words, if they have a disagreement, they can use a palaver too. They would just have a woman mediator. But I never sat in on any of those mediations, any of those palavers myself. But your points are extremely well taken. And you clearly know the Côte d'Ivoire very, very well.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Let's give another round of applause to.
Yes, just why don't we also give a round of applause for our moderator and for Stanton. Thank you all for coming. We could have gone on for a long time. I know some of you have classes and other things, but this is really the point of the palaver. The point of the palaver is not simply to have a presentation. One of the palaver is to have additional information coming from you, who often are the experts right in our midst. And I thank you all for your comments and for your input. And I hope that we can continue this dialogue. And Dr. Stanton, maybe we can bring you back to extend this, particularly on some of those areas that we have not discussed, the issue of women, where palavers don't work, and how can we, in fact, incorporate the traditional African models into some of the things that we're doing now. I think that would be a lively discussion. So thank you all, and look forward to your attending our next palaver.